Welcome, my lively audience! Today I'm proud to present to you the top 10 biggest liars in the SCC. Number 1, Luckster!
I apologize for the lack of activity on this channel. I've had a full-time job since December, and as you can imagine, that kinda cuts out a lot of time to make commentaries. However, my schedule's a bit clearer now, so I can afford to be a little more productive. That said, I have 2 commentaries in the editing phase. One a quad-op that'll be on someone else's channel, and a solo comm on mine, so expect those soon.
Ah yes, Luckster had so much free time that said Solocom never came out! And he made absolutely no commentaries on his channel for over 1 year. Now that's what I call the apex of productivity.
I'm gone for 1 year, and this is the thanks I get.
Well, since the man of the hour is here, why don't you tell us how you spent your ample amount of free time?
Long story short, my work schedule got more hours thrown onto it a week after I made that update video, and I also decided to get involved in a bunch of co-op projects, 3 of which I offered to edit, 2 of which being well over 40 minutes. However, since I finished all of my collaborative projects—
Yo, Luck, when are you gonna get in your lines for my shit, you slow?
Now that I finished all but 1 of my collabs—
Hey guys, it's me, Avi Haltman Gaming, asking you once again why I'm the only fucking human being who's actually done a single goddamn thing for our fucking Ruby try-op, you goddamn Slytherin bastard.
And now that—
The Luckster, what about our co-op? It's been over a year!
I finished my lines for that long ago, Mr. Editor.
Oh.
So now that I've gotten most of my collaborative projects done, Balan Wonderland is not only a game that my friends like to tease me with, but it's also a collectathon platformer that has a rather infamous reputation. With that said, an author at Nintendo Life seems to disagree with this notion, however, since he made an article titled Soapbox in Defense of Balan Wonderland. I had issues with said article before I played the game for myself, and after doing so to cover my bases, I decided this was material. So with that out of the way—
Hold on a minute, Luckster!
Do you want me to be productive or not?
Of course I do! Hence why I would like to offer my services as a voice for the article, so that our audience can have the utmost experience.
And what you'd like in return is—
Boy, you have nothing to offer me other than your audience's eyes and ears.
Flattered.
You're quite welcome. Anyway, on to the article. Hello, my name is—
What was that?
Well, I thought it best to keep the author anonymous. Not only to keep the criticism impersonal, but also as a method to help deter harassment against the individual.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
I think Balan Wonderworld is quite good. Not only that, but the vast majority of criticism I've seen thrown its way doesn't really strike me as especially valid. It is my firm belief that far from being the worst game of the year, Yuji Naka's apparent swan song is, in fact, a remarkably enjoyable game that we all needed to see happen and will one day get the respect it flipping well deserves.
So, right off the bat, we have some language that I'd like you to keep in mind for later. Namely, saying how the author doesn't feel the criticism is valid and how it deserves respect. Because that sets the tone for the rest of the article. That said, I'll be skipping over 1 paragraph because it's just stating that the Switch port is legitimately awful, which, well, it is, so fair enough.
So, what's the story here? What's up with Balan being the industry punching bag? I personally put it down to the Sonic effect. Yuji Naka, as one of Sonic the Hedgehog's de facto creators, tip of the hat to Naoto Oshima, tends to have his projects under the same critical lens. That is a bit of a disingenuous and often ill-informed one. You see, like it or not, Sonic has become a joke for years. The ongoing stream of confused, directionless games in the series, which admittedly would occasionally strike gold, made for such memes as the Sonic Cycle, and bad faith reading of the worst corners of the fandom resulted in plenty of pregnant Sonic humor. Pregnant. Of all the adjectives you could choose. A new game from the creator of Sonic therefore seems to be fair game to take swings at. And here's the thing that gets me about said swings. You can critique Balan until the cows come home, providing your critique is valid and stands up to reality, and it so often didn't.
And now we have an assumption that's completely off bat from why the backlash actually happened, to the point where it makes me wonder if the author was paying attention to any of the hype surrounding the game. Because most people weren't comparing it to Sonic, they were comparing it to Knights, the other game Yuji Naka made that follows the same beats of 2 children follow a whimsical figure into a dreamlike paradise. One look at the comments of the initial launch trailer will tell you that most people were initially hyped for the game because of the comparison to Knights, and the few people that did mention Sonic and Yuji Naka mentioned them as a positive reason for why they were excited for the game. The reason why the game stopped getting good reception afterwards was because of the demo they released, where you can notice the general attitude being a lot more negative towards the game. Also, notice on this IGN gameplay demo with over 96,000 views, most comments are not blaming Sonic or Yuji Naka for the game, but rather pointing out their grievances with it. If by any chance I'm completely off base here and Wonderland was just another victim of the evil Sonic hatedom, then we run into another problem, that being how there are absolutely no sources saying how this was the case. No reviews, no articles, the author brings up a countdown from James Stephanie Sterling later on, but they never bash Yuji Naka or Sonic directly for the game either, so I'm just left here confused.
One small but telling example is actually very recent. At time of this article's publishing, I might add. James Stephanie Sterling's Games of 2021 video calls out Balan Wonderworld in a particularly directionless bit of ranting. But the smoking gun for me was the specific focus on what is admittedly a strange feature. In Balan, you'll find dancing NPCs in each world strutting their stuff to the background music. When you approach them, they fade away and disappear. Is it a bit strange? Yes. Does it make the game bad? No, of course not. It's not even a criticism, and a moment's thought presents two equally compelling reasons why. First, it's a wonderland, a dreamscape. Strange things are commonplace, oddities drift in and out of view, the terrain undulates before you. Ripples of pure energy spark across the landscape with the rhythm of the background music. The disappearing dancers are just part of that aesthetic.
It's just a shame that the vanishing effect doesn't look as ethereal as the other effects you've mentioned. They could have added a glow effect for when the NPCs disappeared, there could have been a cloud of mist that they faded into, they could have added the ripple effects you previously mentioned to the models, but instead they just mechanically fade away with no bells or whistles added to hide the illusion. Just because they were trying to go for a certain aesthetic, that doesn't mean they succeeded in creating the illusion. And if the amount of people complaining about this are as numerous as you claim, then that would speak volumes as to how ineffective it was.
Secondly, and more practically, they're also clearing out clutter from the area in which you're moving your character. Many games do this. Many games make NPCs invisible or transparent when moving the camera into certain positions. Balan does this too, but in a more noticeable and efficient way that fits the strange, ethereal world the developers have created.
So here's where I'm going to play Stephanie's video, because I can tell you missed their point.
Why the fuck do the NPCs, which dance repetitively and creepily, disappear when you get near them? How does a game with such rudimentary graphics treat these characters as if rendering them near you would crush the game's performance?
They knew the game was doing this to clear out clutter, but they thought it made the game look cheaper than it already looked. You even admit that most games make enemies disappear off-screen, while Balan Wonderworld does it in plain view. And no, just because it's a part of the game's aesthetic, that doesn't mean it looks good to everyone, especially since Sterling made it clear that they didn't like the game's aesthetic to begin with. Speaking of, it's rather telling that you ignored all the other complaints Stephanie made towards the graphics, such as the NPC models dancing creepily and repeatedly, and the rudimentary graphics. Yet you made no attempt to debunk these critiques and cherry-picked the fading critique. It's not a good sign when you have to boil down people's criticisms of a game in order to debunk them.
That may seem like a minor thing to pick up upon, but it is a microcosm of most of the issues I see cited with the game from reviewers. They either don't really matter, are easily explained, or simply don't exist.
Given how this article started with you trying to pin the game's poor reception on the mythical Yuji Naka hatedom, and ignoring the bulk of Stephanie Sterling's segment to zero in on one point, I'm not very confident you're going to focus on the main reasons why people dislike the game. It's also important to note that aside from Sterling, no other critic or reviewer is cited in this article, so for all we know, these criticisms could be coming from Planet Zebes for all we care.
Another example, the much derided single-button control scheme. See, in this game, you collect costumes that fundamentally change your abilities, by which I mean they give you an ability. Without a suit, you can only jump, but with a suit, you have different powers. For example, a spider suit lets you climb walls, a pig suit lets you ground pound a la Yoshi, and a dragon suit lets you breathe fire but not jump. That's where the game's strategy comes in. The costumes are extremely situational, yes, but the levels are designed around this. This is where the challenge comes from.
So remember how this article's been implying that most of the criticism against Balan is invalid, and is trying to argue against said criticism? Well, most of the reviews I've seen of this game have actually been criticizing the game for being too easy, mainly due to how simplistic the mechanics and level design are.
Balan Wonderworld frequently seems to ignore the fundamentals of the platforming genre, largely foregoing the usual structure of introducing a mechanic and then building more interesting and challenging sections out of it as you progress. Instead, costumes are generally used for their simplest function a few times, and then tossed aside shortly after. They'll occasionally be needed in other worlds to access optional bits that are rarely worth the effort, but nearly every obstacle is just a matter of having the right costume ability or not. Perhaps most clearly illustrated by this ladder guy, who can make ladders on a handful of ladder spots. Exciting, right? This constant churn of only the most basic ideas left me bored and unengaged for all of the roughly 9 hours it took me to reach the credits.
While visually appealing, most of the stages are far too basic, made up of simplistic challenges like jumping on blocks and hitting switches. There are rare moments of creativity, like using a certain power-up to overcome a hurdle, but it never evolves beyond a very basic level.
This game has some of the most brain-dead level design I've ever seen for a platformer. Jump here, move block here, tap on here, and you're finally done. This game is the definition of A plus B equals C when it comes to gameplay.
And because you take any costume you want into any level you want, it means they have to make each level beatable with most of the costumes in the game. But because of the lack of foresight and the sheer versatility of the costumes in the game, to the point where they couldn't possibly predict what costume you're going to have at any given time, the level design now has to be so incredibly broad and spacious that you're never going to get stuck for not having a costume. But as a direct result of this, the fucking levels become too open and boring and not challenging and basic and just like more annoying.
So the control scheme is like this for the sake of challenge excuse doesn't really work here when people dislike the game for not being challenging enough.
The whole single button thing is a non-issue. For one thing, it isn't really a single button, because you need to use the bumpers to switch costumes.
That is a very big stretch. Oh, I can hit the pause button in Sonic 2. I guess it's not a single button control scheme. The power-ups only have one ability and every other button does the same thing. Pointing out how the bumpers switch power-ups doesn't change that issue. In fact, it makes it worse since it shows they know how to map different functions to multiple buttons, but don't.
Taking a hit causes you to lose the costume you're carrying, which can necessitate re-navigating the stage in order to get the last collectible. Losing progress because you played the game poorly is a normal state for the medium and cannot reasonably be held against Balan Wonderworld.
Yes, it can, because Balan's system is a lot different from the way most games work, where you either lose a life or head back to the nearest checkpoint. Since Balan's failure system forces you to backtrack, and while backtracking is relatively commonplace, it's also normally seen as an obnoxious inconvenience to most players, especially when you have to go through levels you've already played through to progress. Not to mention there are plenty of collectathons, namely the first 3 Spyro games, Yooka-Laylee, Jak and Daxter, and Mario 64, Sunshine and Odyssey, where all or at least most of the collectibles could easily be gotten in the world you entered with your current abilities. In other words, if you lost the wing cap in Mario 64, you didn't have to backtrack to Bomb Bomb Battlefield every time so you could use it in other levels.
Sometimes you'll need to bring costumes or powers in from different stages because the outfit in question isn't available in that level you need it. Pretty standard. Again, Kirby does this a lot, but because it's Balan Wonderworld, this is now bad.
As someone who's only played Kirby's Adventure, I take umbrage with this comparison for 2 reasons. Firstly, because you're comparing a linear action platforming series to a collectathon. With the exception of Kirby 64, you can get to the end of the Kirby games just fine without having to hoard power-ups from other levels. 100%ing the games are a different story, but that's optional at the end of the day. While in Balan, you need certain ones to get collectibles if you want to progress through the game. The second issue I have with this, though, is that aside from Kirby's Adventure on the NES, Kirby's power-ups are a lot more versatile than Balan's. They don't just have one attack or one ability aside from jumping, they can do several different attacks along with having their own unique properties. The umbrella can function as a weapon that protects you from overhead damage and makes you descend slower to help with platforming. Cupid lets you fly, allows you to shoot arrows in multiple directions, and even lets you fire charge shots. The artist ability lets you either use a paintbrush as a weapon or summon enemies to attack you, and it can even give you items when you paint blank signs. Oh, and all of these power-ups let you attack and jump, as opposed to most of Balan's where you had to pick between having one combat ability or being able to jump with one situational platforming ability.
I was delighted when revisiting Balan Wonderworld for this feature because I discovered that I actually like it even more now than I did at release, which was a lot. With the AAA scene so resolute in continuing to hold the player's hand, I was more than happy with Balan simply dropping me in a world and letting me get on with it. I find myself missing multiple collectibles even when I'd absolutely rinsed the stages, which for a fan of exploration is enticing stuff. I'd also enact silly little athletic feats in order to scale parts of the level that did seem like they were supposed to be accessible, only to find hidden gems, much like the very best Mario games. The developers were a step ahead of even your most outrageous moves.
Okay, you personally like an aspect about a game that's present in most of the collectathons. It's good that you were able to enjoy the game, but that doesn't invalidate other people's criticisms, which was the point of this article. You've stated quite a few times how the criticism against the game needs to be valid, and how you felt the criticism of the game was invalid. Yet here, we suddenly shift to purely talking about what you liked about the game, which I'd be completely fine with if this was titled Why I Enjoyed Balan Wonderworld, but instead it's a soapbox trying to defend it from criticism, so all this does is go, well, I liked it, so wah, as opposed to actually pointing out why it doesn't deserve the vitriol. The article goes on for a couple more paragraphs, namely ragging on the Switch port again, so I'll just head into my final thoughts. For an article that wanted to debunk the criticisms against Balan Wonderworld, you didn't really seem interested in trying to figure out where those criticisms were coming from. Instead of citing reviews of the game or other articles criticizing it, your one example was an opinionated countdown, and even then you proceeded to strawman and cherry-pick their issues. Between that and trying to pin the backlash on the mythical Yuji Naka hate-dom as opposed to people not having fun with the game, this entire article just comes off as a blind defense that's more interested in putting the game on a pedestal as opposed to actually arguing against the critique. The best advice I can give to anyone that's willing to listen is that when you're trying to argue a general critique, it's best to show some reviews so that your audience can have an idea of what mindset you're trying to argue against. Since most of this article just felt like it barely touched on other people's opinions and was just going off what they vaguely heard about it. That's all I have to say, so thank you all for watching, and I hope you all enjoyed the video.